I think we're ready to go. Okay, so one day, a couple of Jesus' disciples asked Jesus for permission to murder an entire village of people. That's weird. It's a weird way to start a sermon, but it's a weirder thing to have actually happened. And on its own, like, if all it was these guys asking Jesus, hey man, can we murder all those people? That would be, weird enough, because like that would mean that they feel entitled to murder. That would mean that they feel bloodthirsty enough to murder an entire village. That would mean that they went to Jesus expecting Jesus to like give them a high five and a rubber stamp and a, yeah, guys, go for it. That would already be weird. But what's even like the weirdest part about this, whole thing is they didn't just ask Jesus for permission to murder this entire village of people, but they asked Jesus for permission to call down, they're going to be the ones to call it down, but to call down fire and brimstone from heaven to kill these people, which, as you may recognize from other Bible stories, that's how Sodom and Gomorrah get killed. That's not just a regular killing, that's a divinely inspired holy killing, is what that is. This is not just, hey, we want to kill these people. This was, hey, we want to kill these people in the name of God. We want to kill these people for God's glory or God's will or, because God wants us to. A couple of Jesus' disciples asked Jesus essentially to create holy genocide, to commit holy genocide. And that's really weird. It's maybe weirdest because this is not like the B-listers of Jesus' disciples either. Like there's those disciples that like everybody gets confused. Like no one knows anything about Thaddeus, okay? Those are the B-listers. This was not the B-lister of the disciples. This was James and John. Jesus has this inner circle of people, of disciples, these very, very close people. There's 3 of them, and James and John are 2 of them. This is 2/3 of Jesus's closest disciples, one of which ends up being the first disciple that gets martyred, one of which ends up, outliving everybody else and writing, big chunks of scripture. I mean, James and John are really, really important people. They are forefathers of our faith, and they're people that we really can't ignore when we're talking about who we are as Christians in the past and in the present. And one day, these very important people, these forefathers of our faith, asked Jesus if they were allowed to commit holy genocide on a village. And I think that's really weird. And these are the circumstances. So one day Jesus is out teaching. He is preaching, doing the stuff that Jesus always does. And it got late at night, and that was a problem because, there's no hotels and stuff. And so if you're going to be out, you're going to be out sort of camping under the stars. And that's always really dangerous because, there's wild animals and there's bandits. And it's just a really dangerous situation to be living in first century Roman-occupied Israel. And so Jesus tells his disciples, hey, go ahead, try to find us some lodging, try to find us a place to stay for the night. Go ahead of us. Jesus always traveled with sort of an entourage, and so he sent a couple people ahead who could move a little faster and could really kind of figure himself out. And so he says, hey, go find us some place to go. And so these couple of disciples go and they find this village of Samaritans, and they ask them, hey, we're just passing through. Would it be possible for us to crash with you guys in your village for the night? And the Samaritans said, well, where are you guys going? And they said, well, we're going to Jerusalem. And so the Samaritan village said, no, you can't stay here. And they closed the doors on them, and they left them out in the cold. Now, we should understand that made sense, okay? So Jews and Samaritans didn't get along with each other, and that is an exceedingly large understatement, okay? For 700 years before the birth of Jesus, the Samaritans and the Jews had been at odds with one another. The reason, we don't really know, actually. It has to do with the origin of the Samaritans, and the Samaritans, they talked about, hey, this is our history, this is where we come from, this is who we are. the Jewish people said, well, that's their history, that's who they are, that's what they do. And, both stories were kind of insulting to the other side. And so they didn't really know why they were fighting, because they didn't know where they had come from. They didn't know the history. They just knew they hated each other. And what they knew was that, well, the Samaritans claimed that they were God's people, that their religion was God's religion, that their temple was God's temple, that their priests were God's priests, that their traditions were God's traditions. That's what the Samaritans claimed. And the Jews didn't like that because, well, the Jews claimed all of that. They claimed that their temple was God's temple, and their priests were God's priests, and their traditions were God's traditions, their religion was God's religion. And so that's the source of this animosity. For 700 years, both of these groups of people had been claiming the same things, and they've been fighting over it. I mean, and I don't mean like, leaving nasty, messages on Facebook. I mean like fighting, bloodshed, desecrating each other's religious icons and things like that. I mean, and it was both sides. It was, the Jews were doing it, the Samaritans were doing it. So the Jews and Samaritans ended up really never getting along with each other and never having any real interaction with one another. At the end of the day, they just never got along. So for a group of Jewish people to ask a Samaritan village, hey, can we crash here for the night? It was really expected that the Samaritans would say, no, no, you can't. We wouldn't ask you, and you shouldn't be asking us. The Jews and the Samaritans, we don't get along. We certainly don't spend nights under the same roof or in the same walled village. And so they said no. And it may not even have been real animosity or hostility, I mean, a 700-year-old feud where nobody knows when it began. It may just be that they were just being practical and just saying, well, we're just gonna do what everybody else has always done. But James and John did not see it that way at all. They took a high level of offense to this. They took offense to this to the degree that they said that they were so angry and they were so upset, they said, we should firebomb these people. We should kill all these people in the name of God, show them who God's people really are. And they asked Jesus, hey, can we do that? And of course, Jesus said no. In fact, I'm pretty sure he said, heck no. Probably used stronger language than that, if we're being really honest. Jesus was really clear, like we don't murder people, and we certainly don't murder villages, and we certainly don't murder villages in the name of God. But I am fascinated by the question, because the question itself tells us that, something that they believed that this was something that they could do. I mean, asking the question insinuates certain amounts of information that they had in their head. And so I want to know kind of like why. Why did they feel entitled to want to kill people in the name of God and it be fine? And I think I have an answer. And I think actually that answer revolves around something that the Jews and Samaritans actually agreed with. That for all of their differences, I think the Jews and the Samaritans, that there was one thing that they both could agree on. And that thing that they could agree on was at the core of their dispute, of their disagreement, of their difficulty, of their violence, of their belief that they should kill each other. And to understand what that is, we need to tell one of Jesus' most famous stories. The parable of the prodigal son, which I'm pretty sure you've heard, you probably already know, but just in case, and just so we're on the same page, it goes like this. One day there was a father, and he had two sons. And the younger son came to the father one day, and he had a request. He said, hey, could I have my inheritance, half of this estate? Could I have what I am owed when you die, but could I have it now? Not a great request, not a request that would be the sort of thing that any father really wants to hear, but he hears it and he says, okay, it's yours, you can have it. And the younger son takes half of this money, this large estate, this big inheritance. He takes that money and he leaves home. And he blows it. Like, he spends all this money. He spends it on women. He spends it on partying. He spends it on booze. He spends it on just, everything you would imagine somebody who just has all this money and is young and all that. Just imagine that you have all of this. And he basically buys himself friends, right? So he throws all these elaborate parties, and now he's very popular, and now all these people want to talk to him and want to hang out with him, and that's how it works. And he lived an awesome, exciting, fun life for quite a while, actually. For quite a while. The trouble is, there was no money coming in. It was all just money going out. And so he eventually spends all the money. And, the bad thing was, not just did he didn't just spend all the money, which means, by the way, all the friends left, but he spends all the money, and the money leaves right about the time that a massive famine shows up. A famine shows up, and suddenly there's no food, and there's no jobs, and people are losing their jobs, and people are going hungry, and those are people who didn't spend all their money partying, and those are people that didn't waste everything, and so those people were all trying to survive, and the son was trying to survive the best he could. The only job he could find was a humiliating one for him because, he was Jewish. He ended up getting a job as a hired hand for a pig farmer, which, if you know anything about the Jewish people, they don't hang out with pigs at all. They don't eat pork. Pigs are unclean, and that's just the way it is. But he had no other choices. That's how desperate he was. He had to really, break his faith, break his traditions, and do what he could to survive. And so he worked for this pig farmer. And one day, sort of the straw that broke the camel's back, as he was so hungry, as he was feeding these pigs, he realized that this slop he was giving the pigs was more food and better food than what he'd been eating. And he realized, I am living lower than a pig. And he said, I've got to do something else. I got to do something else with my time. I got to do something else with my life. And so he said, my father, who I insulted and I hurt and I left behind, I'm not worthy to be his son anymore, but he's kind and he's generous and he's loving. So I bet if I go home and I ask him to take me on as a servant, that he would do that. And he convinces himself this is the way it's going to be. He's going to go home and he's going to ask his father to be a slave, and his dad's going to say, okay, and that's how he'll live his days. It'll at least be better than the situation he's in. So he goes home, and if you can kind of picture it in your head, he's got, rags on, he doesn't have any shoes on, he's dirty, he's been living rough, he's homeless, and so he goes home, and he has this plan in his head of becoming a slave. That plan doesn't have, of course, happen because his father had been watching and waiting for his son to come home. And while his son was still far off, the father, sees him in the distance and takes off running to greet his son. And it's sort of this funny exchange where they're totally not on the same page because the son keeps trying to say I'm not worthy to be your son and I want to be your slave and all this stuff. And the dad is totally ignoring everything he has to say because he doesn't care. He's just hugging him and kissing him and telling him how much he loves him and telling him how much he cares. And the son's like, oh, but I'm not worthy to be your son. And the dad's not even hearing it because he's so excited and in his head he wants to throw the party. So he says, hey, my son, you bring him a robe, bring him a ring, bring him some shoes. Those feet look horrible. Bring him some shoes, bring him all this stuff, and let's throw a party. And they killed a fattened calf, which, to be honest, sounds delicious. And they throw this giant barbecue, and they bring everybody, all the neighbors and everybody together for this barbecue. And it's a giant celebration by the father that his son is home. Okay, so everybody's really happy. Everybody's super excited about what's going on, except there's this second son. You see, there's this other son that that's in the story, and he's not very happy at all. While all of this is going on, he was doing what he was supposed to be doing, which is what he did every single day. He was working. He was being faithful and loyal to his father. He was doing the right thing. He was being responsible. He was taking care of his father's estate. He was being the son that everybody wants a son to be. And so, he smells the beef, he smells the barbecue, and he hears the music, and he gets closer, and he sees people dancing, and he hears them laughing, and All this whole scene comes in. He's confused what's going on, and he finds a servant. He says, "Hey, man, what is happening?" And the servant is really excited because he's partying, right? And so he's really, really happy. And he's like, "Hey, your kid brother's home, and we're throwing a celebration for him because he's home and he's been gone for so long, and he's back now." And the older brother was really, really, really mad about this. He was really upset, and you can understand. He's upset. And this is how the story ends, okay? This is how Jesus finishes this story. This is sort of the punchline to the narrative. It's in the Gospel according to Luke, and this is what we read in Luke chapter 15. We read, "The older brother was angry and would not go in. His father came out and begged him, but he replied, 'All these years I've slaved for you, and never once to refuse to do a single thing you told me to. And in all that time, you never gave me even one young goat for a feast with my friends. Yet when this son of yours comes back after squandering your money on prostitutes, you celebrate by killing the fattened calf.' His father said to him, 'Look, dear son, you have always stayed by me. Everything I have is yours. We had to celebrate this happy day. For your brother was dead, and he has come back to life, and he was lost, and now he's found.'" Now, the main point of this story is, of course, the father. Okay, I hate that it's called the parable of the prodigal son. It should be the parable of the loving father or something. I mean, the main focus of the story is the father. And why his father is so gracious and so forgiving and so kind and so compassionate and all that. Like, that is the emphasis of the story. Jesus, Jesus does a lot during his ministry, but a big chunk of what Jesus does is sort of shift a narrative about God. Jesus shows up and teaches that God is different than anybody had ever considered before, that God is better than anybody had ever considered before. And so much of what Jesus is doing during his ministry is painting a picture about the love and compassion and grace of God. And in fact, this story does that as well as anything Jesus ever does. So let's set that aside for a second. And let's talk about the secondary part of this, which is the brothers. You see, these brothers, it's interesting, are more alike, I think, in this story than they would want to admit. Because they both agreed on something. You can see it in the brother, in the older brother. The older brother goes to his father and he has a complaint. He goes to his father and he says, "Look, I have been faithful my whole life. I have done the right thing. I've done what you told me to do. You guys are all partying. I'm out working. Okay, I am keeping this estate going. I am a good son." And by the way, very often when people tell the story, people will try to kind of like poke holes in that and say, "Oh, well, he wasn't a good son." Look, the father never argues with him. There is never a single iota of a shred of evidence here, right? That the older son is not telling the truth. The older son is a good son. He has done everything right. But he looks at his father and he says, "Well, I haven't gotten any return on that investment. I haven't gotten anything for that. Like, I got these friends, and we would love if you just gave us like one little goat, one animal, one something for us to celebrate, but you don't do that for me. You'll celebrate for the other guy who doesn't do anything right, but you're not going to celebrate for me who does everything right." Which is to say, the older son believed that his relationship with his father was one-sided. He was insecure in his relationship with his father. He needed reassurance that his father actually cared. He needed reassurance that his father was doing anything, and he had evidence lined up to say, "Listen, you're not doing for me what I think a father should do." The son was a very good son, but he was incredibly insecure in his relationship with his dad, relationship with his father, because he just didn't see that he was being treated the way he thought he should be treated. And the younger son felt exactly the same way. Now, the text doesn't actually tell us that, but the text does tell us that he asks for his inheritance early, like way early. decades early. Like, hey, I want you to treat me as if you're dead, okay? That's something that he's asking out of insecurity. He's afraid that maybe the money won't be there, right? Or maybe, he's not going to get from his father what he thinks he deserves. He also looks at his father and says, I deserve more than what I'm getting. So give me my inheritance now. Let me go live now. And both brothers, by the way, take out their insecurities with their father on each other. The younger son does it in a dramatic way. He leaves home, which does something really, really difficult for the older son. It gives the older son twice the work. I mean, if you've got these two sons who have this estate to run, this inheritance they're going to do, the father has these two sons. The two sons are supposed to work together, to live and to work and do all the stuff. When one leaves, the work didn't go away. Just, one of the workers did. So the younger brother leaves. That doubles the work for the older brother. And of course, we can see the older brother doesn't like the younger brother either. I mean, he's resentful of him. He doesn't care that he's okay. He doesn't ask how he's been. He doesn't say, what happened to him. He didn't care. He's written his brother off. The two brothers despise one another because they have this insecurity with their relationship with their father, and they take it out on each other. At the core of the story, that's what's going on. Which is why the story actually ends, by the way, with the father. The punchline is to the older son, everything I have is yours. The father reassuring the older brother that, what are you talking about? That's all in your head. Everything I've always had has always been yours. But also it's always been his. Because he's my son too. Now, what in the world does that have to do with trying to kill Samaritans? Well, see, maybe we need to tell one more story. I'm not sure we're ready yet. Let's tell one more story. So one day, Jesus is out teaching, doing the same things he always does, and he stops around the Samaritans. Today, though, it's not late at night. He's not looking for a place to stay. It's around lunchtime, and Jesus is hangry. Okay, he is tired. They walk on foot all day, just all day walking on foot. He's thirsty, and he's not going another step until he gets lunch. So he sits down on this well, and he tells his disciples, look, go get me some food, okay? Everybody, we're all going to eat. It's going to be great. They're like, okay. Jesus gets like that. It's his blood sugar. We don't know about that for 1,800 years, but we're going to find it out one day. It's his blood sugar. And so they go away, Jesus by himself, and here comes this Samaritan woman to get water from this well. And they strike up a conversation. And in the midst of the conversation, Jesus, talks to her, and she discovers, in her mind at least, that Jesus is a prophet. Meaning, throughout their conversation, she ends up realizing this guy can speak for God. And this Samaritan woman who is devout, she's religious, she lives a life to the best of her ability, that is set apart, that is worshiping God. She ends up saying, hey, look, you're a prophet. I have a question. And this is what we read the question is. In the gospel according to John, we read this. Sir, the woman said, you must be a prophet. So tell me, why is it that you Jews insist that Jerusalem is the only place of worship? Well, we Samaritans claim it is here at Mount Gerizim, where our ancestors worshiped. Jesus replied, believe me, dear woman, the time is coming when it will no longer matter whether you worship the Father on this mountain or in Jerusalem. You Samaritans know very little about the one you worship, while we Jews know all about him. For salvation comes through the Jews, but the time is coming. Indeed, it's here now when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. The Father is looking for those who will worship him that way. For God is spirit, so those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. We're going to get to the Jesus stuff in a minute, but the question by the woman is fascinating. I mean, imagine you have a prophet, this guy's a prophet. You can ask anything. You can ask tomorrow's lotto tickets if you want, right? You can ask anything. What does this woman ask? Well, she asks Jesus to settle 700 years of debate. But she asks it in an interesting way. She says, why is it that you Jews insist that Jerusalem is the only place of worship? Notice the wording there. Why do you Jews say you can only worship in Jerusalem? And then notice the word of the next thing. Well, we Samaritans claim it's here at Mount Gerizim, meaning the only place to worship. This woman asks this question because at the core of what she believes is this: there can only be one. At the core of what she believes, that's it. There can only be one God's people. There can only be one temple. There can only be one, one religious expression. There can only be one tradition. There can only be one. Meaning, if the Jews are God's people, inherently, by necessity, by the rules she has created, or, their culture they have created, that means the Samaritans must not be God's people. If the Jews are God's people, the Samaritans are not God's people. If the Samaritans are God's people, the Jews are not God's people. By the way, the Jews agree with that. That belief is at the core of what James and John were doing. That belief is at the core of the brothers, by the way. Where they believe that a relationship with God, a relationship with the Father, a relationship with whatever, that everything in this world is finite and limited. That there's only so much to go around. And so if we get ours, that means they don't get theirs. Which is to say, if they get theirs, we don't get ours. James and John felt perfectly comfortable asking Jesus, whose nickname is the Prince of Peace, by the way, if it was okay if they murdered a village of people in the name of God, because James and John believed that the Jews were God's people and therefore the Samaritans were not God's people. Which means they were enemies of God. Which means God's fine with him being killed. The core belief at the heart of 700 years of debate between the Jews and the Samaritans was a belief that God's love is finite. It is a resource to be mined. And if I mine it, he can't. And if he mines it, I can't. So I need to do everything I can to make sure I'm the one who's mining it and he's not. Which is it? Is Jerusalem the only place to worship? Or is Mount Gerizim the only place to worship? Jesus disagrees with all of this, as it turns out. Which is not to say that Jesus doesn't take a side. Jesus absolutely takes the side of the Jews. He says salvation comes from the Jews. But we have forever in this passage looked at this and I think missed something. Jesus tells them, he says, you Samaritans know very little about the one you worship. And we always focus on the very little part, like the Samaritans are wrong. And we don't focus on the fact that Jesus just told a Samaritan woman that they are worshiping the same God he is. I just need to read that out loud again. You Samaritans know very little about the one you worship. Well, we Jews know all about him. Same God. By the way, if you could jump in a time machine and go back, 2,000 years, between 2,000 and 2,700 years, a real good way to get yourself slapped would be to find a Jew and say, the Samaritans worship the same God you do, right? Or find a Samaritan and say, the Jews? Yeah, it's the same stuff you're doing. They're doing the same stuff. Same God. It's a real good way to get yourself slapped. And then you get back in your TARDIS and you come back. It's fine. The Jews and the Samaritans were rivals because they believed that everything was finite. And Jesus says that's not the way this works. It's not the way this works. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what mountain. It doesn't matter what faith expression. It doesn't matter what tradition. It doesn't matter. What matters is spirit and truth. And by the way, there is no limit on spirit and truth. God is spirit. God's spirit in the world, working, living, breathing, moving, holding things together. There is no limit to the Spirit of God working in this world. And there is no limit to what truth is in our lives. Truth is truth. There's no limit to it. It just is. We all can put our hands around it. Jesus puts as a foundation of faith and worship and theology and religion things that are inherently limitless, where it is not a finite resource where one mines the other doesn't. Jesus says, no, this is for everyone. There's plenty to go around. There's more than enough. Everyone can win. Everyone. And that brings us to why I'm talking about this today. We're in our second week of our series called Love Your Enemy. We've been talking about, starting last week and this week, the fact that we live in a world that is in the middle of a culture war. And we live in a nation where, man, everybody hates each other. And of course, not everybody hates each other, but I mean, like, in general, like, people are not getting along. There is this massive divide between right and left, red and blue, Republican, Democrat. There's a massive divide between progressive and conservative. And it's not just a divide, right? Like, it's a divide that it's not just, oh, I disagree with the way you look at things. It's not what it is. It's not, well, I see things differently and we can be friends. No, it's we have set up our tribal camps. And we believe that the other side is bringing about the end of our nation. And we just assume, well, something bad happens, it must be those guys. Something good must be us. And everything we do and everything we are gets filtered through that information, through that lens. Well, we've been called to love our enemies. So even if the person on the other side, whoever that might be for you, is your enemy, guess what? You've been called to love your enemy. And so as we talk about how we do that, I think the lesson this morning is really, really important to recognize this. What actually matters in life is not a finite resource. Me winning does not mean my enemy loses. My enemy winning does not mean I lose. See, we can all win. Because if what actually matters is spirit and truth, if what actually matters is the presence of God and what is actually real and not what we make up in our heads, then there's room for everyone. There's more than enough for everyone. It's not a zero-sum game where when I win, they lose. Or vice versa. It's an ability where, look, we can both lose and we can both win. And recognizing that our belief that there can only be one, that this culture war is only won when everyone looks, acts, thinks, believes like me. Guys, no one needs to think like you. No one needs to agree with you. No one needs to believe what you believe. No one. The world does not owe you people who look at you and say, well, that guy's right. Did you hear her? She's real smart. That doesn't exist. What exists is the truth. That we all have the same Father. And maybe we think we're the older son, maybe we think we're the younger son, but either way, we're sons. And there's room for everyone. And just because we sit at the table does not mean we take a seat from someone else. And I got to tell you, if we could wrap our hands around that, there's a whole lot of things that would be solved like that. If we could recognize that for me to win, it doesn't mean that you lose. But that we're all on the same page here because we're all people and we're all just trying our best here. And if we could recognize that, then it's an awful lot easier to love our enemy because we stop seeing them as our enemy in the first place. This morning, we're in our second week of our series called Love Your Enemy. As we think about James and John wanting to slaughter these people because they believed they were God's enemies. Think about the prodigal sons, both of them were prodigal in different ways. Insecure in their relationship with their fathers. We think about this woman whose belief is that for her to win, someone else has to lose, and Jesus is flat telling her, I disagree. As we look at all of that, we've got a framework for us, no matter what anybody else is doing, for us to look at in the way that we look at people, the way we treat people, the things we do day in and day out as Christ's followers, as God's people. This is what we learn. Our second lesson from our series called Love Your Enemy is this. What matters is God's spirit and truth, which are never finite resources. So there's plenty for us all. What matters, ultimately, eternally, what matters is God's spirit and truth, and they are never finite resources. So there's plenty for us all the time. So when the musicians are going to come forward, we're going to sing a song. We offer an invitation. And take God up on his offer of worshiping in spirit and truth, of embracing God's spirit in our lives, in our hearts, in our minds, and what's going on in the world. And for standing for the truth, whatever it may be. The Bible teaches that when we want to do that, we're to repent, to be baptized. It sounds like two things. It's just one. In repentance, we say, I want to change my mind. I want to be different. And in baptism, it's a picture of what that looks like, of what that means. As we align ourselves with Jesus, we join ourselves with Christ's death and resurrection in our own watery, allegorical death and resurrection, and we are made brand new, connected to Christ forever. If you've never made a decision, we got a baptistry. We got all sorts of people who can do it. Let's talk. If you're an immersed believer in Christ, you're looking for a perfect church home, this place is not it. We do so for a perfect God. We want to connect, we want to call, we want to cultivate, we want to meet new people, we want to share the gospel, we want to grow up while we do it. And we want to be people who recognize that God blessing us does not mean that he's cursing someone else. That there is room at the table for everyone. There is room in God's spirit and truth for everyone. And we don't approach life that, hey, we are the only ones who are right, or my way of looking is the only way of looking at it. It's not what we do. Instead, we recognize that we have a shared Father, a shared Savior, a shared Spirit, and a shared life. As we stand,